Over a year ago, I suggested that the Global Systemic Risk crew take up Ulrich Beck's work for discussion, and I'm really glad we're doing so today, although I could not have foreseen that our gathering would have an elegiac tone. But I would say our PIIRS project is surely part of his legacy. And I'll be focusing on just tap. Two of his books, in particular among his corpus, his Risk Society, which was first published in German in 1986, and World at Risk in 2007, and both were subsequently published in English. Ulrich Beck's Risikogesellschaft was published in German in 1986, as I mentioned, which was a year before the Challenger explosion and the Chernobyl reactor meltdown, but after 3 Mile Island and the Bhopal disaster. By the time Risk Society was published in English in 1992, it was read largely as a commentary on these technological accidents, above all Chernobyl, and I think some of my fellow panelists will have something to say about that. Now, this didn't require an imaginative leap, for Beck pinpointed radioactivity and environmental contaminants as exemplars of the uncontrollable hazards that he had in mind. As he puts it in Risk Society, by risks, I mean above all radioactivity, which completely evades human perceptive abilities, but also toxins and pollutants in the air, the water, and foodstuffs, together with accompanying short and long-term effects on plants, animals, and people. They induce systematic and also irreversible harm, generally remain invisible, are based on causal interpretations, and thus initially only exist in terms of the scientific or anti-scientific knowledge about them. And I read you this whole quote to underline the important role of science in the ontology of agents like this. Beck argued further that some people are more affected than others by these new risks, and in fact he contended social inequalities had shifted from being centered on wealth to being centered on risk. Or as Brian Wynn and Scott Lash have put it, and when Bronislaw Snarozowski, in their nice commentary, Beck argued that an older industrial society whose axial principle was the distribution of goods was being displaced by an emergent risk society structured, so to speak, around the distribution of bads. Class, in this view, was not undermined, but rather reinscribed by risk. But even so, the privileged could not shield themselves completely from the byproducts of technology. Experts in the safety systems they design, Beck argued, are ultimately incapable of presenting disasters. And when a technological catastrophe happens, the hazards affect everyone. Beck refers to this as the boomerang effect. Technology bites back. Now, I want to linger over Beck's striking depiction of technology's dangers outpacing the ability of experts to control them. And a few features of his picture deserve our consideration today, in my view. First, Beck's Risk Society is a thoroughly secular society. Threats such as shipwreck, famine, or fire can only be transformed into calculable risks in a non-providential world. Beck observes that the emergence of the insurance system relies on seeing society in terms of risk groups, and he draws on Francois Ewald's work in making clear that with insurance, a provident state emerges, in effect replacing the providence and agency of God. At the same time, more aspects of society that had previously been natural or religious, so family size, upbringing, gender roles, are now seen as social, and this puts on individuals the burden of making wrong or risky decisions. And for Beck, all of this is part of secular modernity, as indeed it seemed to many academics in the 1970s and 80s. Yet, events of the last 30 years have raised questions about the limits of secularization, as Beck himself grappled with in his later work, World at Risk. There he says that risks themselves are culturally situated. And speaking of Al-Qaeda, for instance, he says some people view the Al-Qaeda terrorism through religious spectacles and see it as confirming prophecies of the apocalypse. For others, risks enter the world stage only after God has made his exit. Now, Beck refers to this as the clash of risk cultures, but I do wonder whether this view sufficiently captures the importance of religious frameworks and motivations. In World at Risk, Beck focuses on how the post-9/11 society tries to manage new risks by anticipating and staging them, as he puts it. But by contrast, I am struck that religious commitments themselves help to produce the risky scenarios and actual catastrophes of the early 21st century. So I do think that the centrality of secularization is worth reflecting over, whether this is a problem with Beck's theory. Second, the hazards that characterize risk society are not contained by national borders. And from the outset, Beck pointed to the diffusion of pollutants to argue that risk society is in this sense a world risk society. And this is an issue he develops even further in World at Risk. Oh, first I wanted to give you this quote, which is that the particular pattern of modernization risks possess an inherent tendency towards globalization. And I won't read all of this quote, but you might just skip down to the bottom in this nice phrase. He talks about acidification, how it dips under borders, and has brought around about the disintegration of modern customs barriers. So in his view, these modern technological risks have actually eroded national sovereignty in very important ways. And he elaborates on this at World at Risk, arguing that global crises bring countries into an often uneasy relationship. Nations find that they are fated to a common future even if they have not had a common past. As Beck puts it, they are condemned to respond, he says, of national and international bodies, and that the kind of counterfactual of disaster prompts them to respond even when all available response models fail. Third, at least in his early work, Beck seems to me to be a scientific realist, even though he is highly critical of science and technology. As the same commentators have put it, it is the genuine, real, physical riskiness of, for example, large-scale nuclear and chemical technologies that has taken industrial society beyond its own limits of calculability. So, on the one hand, in Beck's view, scientific rationality refutes itself by being unable to predict or deal with unintended consequences of technology. But on the other hand, Beck's own reference to false scientific conclusions and ecological realities indicates that he's not a relativist so far as knowledge is concerned. Moreover, as fallible as experts might be, they are the only individuals with access to knowledge. As Brian Wynne has observed, there's no room in Beck's picture for the epistemic value of lay knowledge. So ultimately, and this is something that Beck addressed later on at World at Risk, trying to reconcile his scientific realism and the kind of environmental reality that is important to risk society with constructivist insights. It's not entirely clear to me, though, that his way of reconciling it is satisfactory. So ultimately, the risk society rests on an inescapable dilemma. Scientific rationality refutes itself. Technology cannot contain the negative externalities from late industrialization, yet this very diagnosis relies completely on scientific evaluation. So the other issue, it seems to me, with his approach to scientific realism is that it doesn't leave enough space for scientific and technological uncertainty, which in my own work on radiation safety and environmental contaminants is an enormous part of the paralysis of the state in dealing with these new hazards. Lastly, I'd like to draw attention to one feature of Beck's work which isn't focused on science and technology. Most commentary on risk society focuses, as I have so far, on part one, which is appropriately entitled Living on the Volcano of Civilization, the Contours of Risk Society. But in part two, which focuses on individualization, another important element of his theory, Beck pays attention to gender roles. His analysis of how economic and technological changes put pressure on the family and on sexual relations was very much of its time, but also, I think, quite insightful. And so I wanted to draw out one quote from this section of the book that really struck me. The spiral of individualization is thus taking hold inside the family. Labor market, education, mobility, everything is doubled and trebled. Families become the scene of a continuous juggling of diverging multiple ambitions among occupational necessities, educational constraints, parental duties, and the monotony of housework. The type of negotiated family comes into being in which individuals of both genders enter into a more or less regulated exchange of emotional comfort, which is always cancelable. And I have to say, although this part of the book doesn't receive as much attention, I find this to be as haunting a portrait of late industrial life as the constant anxiety about environmental hazards, with which he's so well known. Thank you.
So I don't have any slides. I had one great slide of a doctor's eye that was infected with Ebola, but I didn't manage to get enough to surround it, and I didn't think that that would kind of be enough to illustrate my talk. So I wanted also to say that it's a great pleasure to participate on this panel, and I'd like to thank Miguel Centeno for inviting me here as a visiting scholar to join the Global Systemic Risk Group this year, and also Mark Beisinger and PIIRS, the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, for the funding that made this research community possible. So the global systemic risk community, as its name suggests, has been focusing on those risks that are global and that are systemic. And I would like to devote my 15 minutes to considering the ways in which the work of Ulrich Beck can help us think about such risks and society's capacity to control them. So, as Angela has just pointed out so well, Beck, according to him, the industrial age, with its emphasis on rational calculations and elaborate planning, is over. Now we have a new form of modernity that inherently involves more risk or uncertainty than the rational industrial age. Now we have a new age, a new social system, where one of its greatest achievements, technology, has also created new risks and a new condition of generalized uncertainty, risk society. But we might ask, surely risks have always been around. Do we face new types of risks? Beck says yes. He says the consequences of scientific and industrial development are a set of risks and hazards that we have never previously faced, in spheres ranging from ecology to finance. Why is that? Well, first of all, they cross national boundaries. They're global. They're no longer limited in time because future generations are affected. And thirdly, no one can be held accountable for these risks. I mean, there's always an effort at pointing to evildoers, but it's very difficult. And finally, it's becoming very difficult to compensate people affected by these risks because the risks are not calculable. So that then brings us to the question of, can modern risks be anticipated? And yes, says Beck, these new risks are in fact anticipated catastrophes. They are actually the product of the ambition of societies to anticipate potential dangers. And so here I think he has something to say to our global systemic risk community, because this field is built on two sets of literature. First, a tradition of work on normal accidents, like the Challenger disaster, which argues that potential catastrophes are inevitable in complex, tightly coupled systems. And secondly, an emerging body of work on complexity theory and global systemic risk, which raises the possibility that the interactions in an increasingly dense, global, and interdependent web of trade, finance, and infrastructure may generate these unstoppable, cascading threats to system survival. So in both these literatures, catastrophic risks appear to be inconceivable and unforeseen. And this is, in fact, one of the things that has struck me and that I've been thinking about because of working in this group, because if that's the case, then this group has a tough time, because surely the whole point of this group is to be able to intervene so that these catastrophes do not occur. But Beck does something for us also. He restores a notion of human agency with his idea of reflexive modernization. For Beck, living with risk means that we are living with perpetual self-consciousness. Now that is really exhausting. However, though it may be exhausting, it means that hypothetically we are capable of acting so as to avert the worst. but perhaps not entirely. When we come to the question of how risk governance is to be achieved and catastrophe averted, the role of human actors in Beck becomes a little murky. At one level, Beck's answer to this question, how we get a grip on risk, is that it's an automatic process. New challenges, new risks produce global cooperation. He was really an incorrigible optimist. As recently as 2011, after 9/11, after the global financial crisis, he could argue that, quote, out of the experience of global threat situations and risk interdependencies, there can emerge more or less involuntarily a pressure to cooperate. Oh, would it were so. I mean, for him, the European Union was the shining example of this. It had taken away, it had taken away a lot of things from nation states and forged this cooperation. Now, some of his critics argued that his view was too Eurocentric, but he pressed on to a larger terrain, examining the effects of globalization. Globalization is not all bad, he said. It has aroused, quote, a cosmopolitan everyday consciousness which transcends even the borders between man, animal, and plant. And this became his last big argument. We are in a cosmopolitan moment. Traditional institutions have eroded, and we're seeing the rise of transnational forces which have promoted a new type of solidarity. And these are really twofold. There are new social movements that have emerged, and there are new ideas, things like the precautionary principle, the emphasis on sustainability. And the only thing that could hold us back is a retrograde nationalism. Now, the recent outcome of the British election would certainly lead one to agree with that. And there is indeed much else in Beck's analysis to agree with. Yes, we are in a cosmopolitan moment if we take that to mean that the scale of the risks facing the world and our experience of the consequences of those risks open up possibilities for new avenues of action. Crisis promotes, as Beck said, a recognition of interdependence across national boundaries, and what he called a cosmopolitan realpolitik, namely the growing recognition that national interests can be promoted only by transnational institutions and transnational actions. But the pressing question then is whether such action can be successfully realized, and if so, how. New risks may produce a desire for global cooperation, but as we all know, there's a big gap between desire and actualization. How do we get from here to there? And here I would argue that we have to turn to the question of the incentives and the transnational institutions in a globalized world. And I want to turn to a few examples from the field of global health. How much time do I have, Miguel?
About 7 minutes.
Oh, good. So, which is the field I work in. I look at how do societies deal with those health risks that they perceive, correctly or not, as coming from beyond their borders. So first, how strong are the international institutions we have built to anticipate and govern risks? And here, I think this is something we have to add to Beck's analysis, because he often doesn't pay attention to the institutional piece. And if we turn to the recent Ebola epidemic, we can find an avalanche of criticism oriented towards WHO. But WHO is as strong as its member states. It's true that there were not people on the ground in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia who had expertise in handling emergencies of this kind, and WHO was excoriated for this. But why was that? That was because WHO representatives in those countries were elected locally. And a job like this, WHO representative, it held the promise for its incumbents of a route out of poverty at least. Much is being said about the reform of WHO, but even if such structural features were changed, there's a second issue we need to bear in mind. We should not forget that collective action dilemmas will play in the process whereby we get from here to there. And on this, I think Beck has something very important to tell us. By implication, at least, his analysis suggests that the very character of the actors and what some would call their preferences is subject to change in the face of global events. And I think that's true. However, it may not have entirely eliminated self-interest or national interest. Globalization has done other things than Beck's sunny picture portrays. It has, for one thing, increased the gap between rich and poor nations. And with respect to many global health problems, securing long-term gains will depend on bearing and distributing short-term losses. And there is good evidence that people care more about short-term losses than long-term gains. So this means there will be intense conflict about who is to bear the costs, both within nations and across nation states. Resolving these conflicts entails, among other things, resolving collective action dilemmas, some of which are highly intractable. And one example that springs to mind is the case of avian flu and the actions of Indonesia. Now, some of you may not remember that far back, 2003. Everybody was hysterical. It wasn't everybody said, if we had a global pandemic of avian flu, it was when. And every newspaper was full of pictures of dead crows and the warning they were going to get us next. So Indonesia, in the early 20,000s, had the largest number of human cases of avian flu, mostly contracted from poultry, not transmitted person to person. And so it was sending its viral strains to WHO in order to help generate a vaccine. But at a certain point, and I think this was in fact due to national politics, Indonesia said, we're not sending any more viral strains to WHO. And WHO and the world said, why? Why? I mean, this is a good thing. And it'll make it much harder for us to get a vaccine. And Indonesia said, so how much of this putative vaccine has been allocated to developing countries, the frontline countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, etc.? And the world said, we haven't actually been thinking about this. I don't think there's a sort of a number. We don't have the vaccine yet, etc. And so Indonesia said, well, forget it. And so this issue was argued out in international forum after international forum, everywhere you went, G8, this, that, and the other thing. And finally, it was negotiated that were a pandemic to emerge, 10%, I think was the figure, would be allocated to developing frontline nations. But the question remains, in terms of global governance, if there is an eventual pandemic, will that promise hold? Do we think that promise will hold? WHO doesn't have shock troops. We'll see. I mean, I hope we won't see, but we may see. So thirdly, in terms of a question for Beck and adding to the way Beck has been thinking about transnationalism, we live in a world of, we really believe, we hope, of the internationalization of science, right? It's our big weapon. And scientists go, they're no longer national, provincial. The Pasteur Institute is now publishing articles in English for the first time in the 2000s, whereas before it did it in French. And so, and indeed, the International AIDS Conference is a good example. They've been trying to bring in not just international scientists, but also HIV-infected people, social movements, and so on and so forth. But I don't think we're there yet. And again, I think we need to think carefully about the way incentives within science are structured. Some of you may have read a piece in the New York Times. It was actually an op-ed piece, which was a letter written by a number of officials in the Liberian Ministry of Health. And it said, "We have been warned." And what they were talking about was that the conventional wisdom among public health authorities was that the Ebola virus was a new phenomenon in West Africa, not seen before 2013. And then they stumbled across an article by European researchers in the Annals of Virology. And in that article, it was said, the results seem to indicate that Liberia has to be included in the Ebola virus endemic zone. In the future, medical personnel in Liberian health centers should be aware of the possibility that they may come across active cases and thus be prepared to avoid epidemics caused by hospital-acquired infection. So the conventional wisdom was wrong, but the thing that stunned these people was that that paper was published in 1982. And the German virologists who wrote that report had analyzed frozen blood samples taken in 1978 and 1979 from 433 Liberian citizens. They found that 6% had antibodies to the Ebola virus. Several other studies published in 1986 documented Ebola antibody prevalence rates of 10.6, 13.4, and 14% respectively in northwestern Liberia, not far from its borders with Sierra Leone and Guinea. And so this suggested, indeed what they said, was that Ebola had become endemic. It would be an endemic zone in Liberia. And the problem was that none of these articles were co-written by a Liberian scientist. The investigators collected their samples, went home, and published the results in European medical journals. And very few Liberians were then trained in laboratory epidemiological methods. So they conclude that in their letter, to our knowledge, no senior official now serving in Liberia's Ministry of Health had ever heard of the antibody studies findings, nor had top officials in the international organizations valiantly supporting the Ebola response in Liberia, including United Nations agencies and foreign medical teams. So the funding of science and the organization of science is often national. The criteria for professional success and advancement tend to be similar internationally. And so although there's an international dialogue about sharing the results of science with the subjects of studies, we have a long way to go to make that happen. Professional incentives would have to change to achieve the rosy vision of a selfless sharing of knowledge. Yes, there is a growing transnational society, but from an institutional perspective, the institutions with capacities that outrank many others are those of national states. So we should not overestimate what social movements can do, and we should not underestimate what national states can do, both for good and for ill, while clinging desperately to Beck's optimism and allowing that to move us forward.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Miguel, for the invitation. Thank you, Angela, for the idea. And thank you, Angela, also for giving me the idea for what I'm going to be saying today, because she did that last week. So I am not a sociologist, but I play one in front of the classroom occasionally. I am a historian of science, so what I'm going to do here is talk a little bit about the history, looking at some aspects. Hang on. I'm sorry, it's going to get all dark in here, but you won't be able to see anything otherwise. Not that it's so fabulous, but you'll see something. I'm talking about sociology as a kind of knowledge and look at the history of knowledge in terms of Beck, because there's something very peculiar about Beck. So I'm not going to talk about his reflexive modernization theory or his desire to try and come up with a critical theory, which doesn't always put us being post something, like that we're always after whatever the thing is we're supposed to be talking about. But I'm interested in a specific historical accident, and the pun is actually intended, about the publication of Risk Society. So just a simple observation, but there's something strange about it. And I think some reflections on that will help us perhaps talk a little bit about how we think about a particular kind of risky accident. So what do I mean by this? Well, in late 1985 and early 1986, this guy was submitting his final revised manuscript of a book for publication. And he did, and it was being produced and copy edited, and that takes a very long time, as people who have done this before have known. And then on April 26, 1986, while that was happening, this happened. During a routine, well, somewhat routine, a test to try and figure out how long the Pripyat Chernobyl nuclear reactor was going to work on backup power, they shut down all the safety mechanisms and ran a test to see what would happen. It overheated. There was no way of stopping it, and then the reactor blew, sending a plume of radioactive materials into the air. There's either 1 or 2 explosions, and then everybody in Europe, including this man here, Ulrich Beck, are looking all of a sudden at graphs like this all the time about the distribution of radioactive isotopes as they spread everywhere. This is a particularly stylized graph. I don't know where they think they get these numbers because it doesn't actually look like this. But what you can see is Chernobyl, which is located somewhat to the north of Kiev. And then notice the way the wind is moving. It's a Soviet nuclear reactor, but the wind has shifted everything off to the west. And in particular, Northern Europe, Germany, and Britain are the places which have substantially higher densities, which is interesting because the place where Beck's work ends up getting picked up the most is Germany, Northern Europe, and the UK. That's not an accident. So this happens in April, and then shortly after this happens, this book comes out in German, Risikogesellschaft, in late '86. So every single human being who reads this book cannot read it except thinking about Chernobyl, with the exception of Ulrich Beck. He's like the only person who can actually look at this text and not have Chernobyl in his mind at all times. So this book becomes a template for how we think about Chernobyl. And we end up getting a kind of looping effect where everybody who reads this book thinks, and I remember this until Angela corrected me, as it being a direct commentary on Chernobyl. And everybody who learns about Chernobyl, who knows anything about Beck, reads Beck into it as a circulation of risks and a distribution where the Soviets impose a risk on the rest of the world, and the rest of the world had no say in that matter. So he actually participated in this, and it became even more of a case when you get the translation of the book into English, which happens 6 years after the publication, so it happens in 1992, which makes it even more the case. The Soviet Union's now gone when this book appears in English. So this book has now a preface which refers to Chernobyl. The presence of nuclear stuff on it in the book becomes read through that light. And the canonical nuclear accident that everybody talked about at the time when Beck was writing this book, which I'll get to in a minute, 3 Mile Island, is no longer on anybody's radar screen. Everybody reads this as about Chernobyl. The essential connection of Beck's Risk Society to Chernobyl is something that actually happens, that he participates in, but it's most strong in English. In 1987, in the Berkeley Journal of Sociology, this article is published, which is a translation of a 1986 article in Die Merkur in German, which is a specific attempt to try and apply his theory to the case of Chernobyl. This comes out roughly around the same time the book comes out in German. So even in German, he's already doing this. But in the US, the first exposure anybody has to Risk Society who doesn't actually read German is this article, and this article makes the equation for everybody themselves. And he began to rethink the implications of the analysis entirely through this particular accident. He states in this particular piece that the event occurs between the submission and the appearance of Risk Society, so he notices the same thing I'm pointing out here, but English readers never got a chance to think about the book in any other way. It was always filtered through this metric. And so we get that twinning, where thinking about this is thinking about that, and thinking about that is thinking about this. We've actually been here before with nuclear thinking, with this. TMI, despite what people think it means today, it was canonical abbreviation for 3 Mile Island, the nuclear reaccident that happened in western Pennsylvania in '79. There's a picture of 3 Mile Island. The reactor is this one that goes critical, has a partial meltdown, but nothing is released into the environment. The reason why anybody remembers this in sociology classes today is because of this man, Charles Perrow, who wrote a book about it called Normal Accidents. For some reason, the normal got, oh, it's in there, you can see it. He was put on the commission to study what happened at 3 Mile Island. He was a professor of sociology at that time at Yale. And he came up with an extremely influential interpretation of what happened. As Rosemary already articulated, everything basically functions along 2 axes. You have things that are linear and things that are complex, and then you have things that are loosely coupled and things that are tightly coupled. The university is an incredibly complex case, but it's rather loosely coupled. So when something goes wrong, like the microphone doesn't work, the building doesn't fall apart and we can still function. Whereas if you have something like a nuclear reactor or a space launch, those are things that are tightly coupled and complex. Those will inevitably, normally, break down. This way of thinking about 3 Mile Island is also canonical. It's almost impossible to think about 3 Mile Island without thinking about normal accidents and vice versa. What's strange is that for Perot, the only normal accident in the history of the world was 3 Mile Island. When you ask him, was Chernobyl a normal accident? He goes, no. Well, it was actually, there was human error. And was the space shuttle accident? Well, no, actually there was this thing going on. Was Fukushima? No. So for Perot, 3 Mile Island is entirely twinned with this theory, but it's not portable. I mean, people do transport it around, but it doesn't have quite the legs that the Risk Society does. And that's, and he especially insisted on differentiating it from Chernobyl, which means that the only way that's not true so much for Beck. This is obviously the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactor accident. No, the interpretation of this as a normal accident is almost non-existent. The interpretation of this as part of the Risk Society is omnipresent. It's one of the dominant ways of thinking about TEPCO's behavior in the accident. Why are the reactors located in Fukushima? Why were they treated the way they were? Because the distribution of risks within the island of Honshu towards certain people and away from other people. So Beck's theory has become incredibly fluid, in part because it has gotten grafted onto nuclear accidents specifically, much more than acid rain anywhere else. And anytime a nuclear accident happens, Beck's theory comes out again and is grafted onto it. There is, as far as I know, no major sociological theory that attempts to address itself to Fukushima directly the way Beck's gets grafted onto Chernobyl, or Perot's directly derives from TMI, because Beck already gives us the one that we need. So the framework has actually proven incredibly helpful for moving beyond just this particular reaction the reactor accident that happened in Ukraine. But it does that in part because it wasn't actually designed for the reactor accident that happened in Ukraine. It was designed before that actually happened. And one way you can see that is there is actually a reasonable literature on Chernobyl which references Beck never. Particularly Producing Power, which is a very good history of the Soviet nuclear reactor industry, which came out this year, has no reference to Beck, no footnote to Beck, and only one footnote on risk, and that footnote on risk does not refer to Beck. The reason for that is because in the Soviet context, it's actually not a very helpful framework. There are actual people that you can blame, there's an actual sociology of the industry that you can study, and the risks don't fall into the state that then ends up becoming the successor state of the Soviet Union. So the places that are heavily, heavily damaged by this are Belarus and Ukraine, which are no longer part of Russia's grasp. As a result, the only book that actually talks about Chernobyl and Beck in a specific sustained way is Adriana Petrina's Life Exposed, which is about Ukrainian ways of understanding their exposure to this reactor accident. So in a sense, we get a Beckless vision of Chernobyl if you look at it from Soviet sources, because the Soviet sources and the Russian sources that come after it actually aren't caught up in the same kinds of, oh, this isn't something that we're responsible for, this is an invisible risk that crossed borders. That's not a framework that's very useful for them. And looking at the comparative reception of Chernobyl histories within the Russian sphere, whether it's Anglophone studies of Russia or Russia itself, and Western studies actually gives you a nice natural bifurcation in the literature that if somebody wanted to look up and study more deeply, I think you'd find an interesting way in which literature segment based on experiences of this moment. And that's all I wanted to say for today, so thank you all very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation, particularly to Miguel, Rosemary and Angela. I want to talk a little bit today about the forgotten half of the theory which Angela referred to earlier, especially in the light of some comments about the limitations of the environmental thesis. Now this literally is the other half of the theory as far as Beck was concerned. He attached equal importance to the whole thesis about individualization. And a lot of people would argue it's kind of the more important half, the more insightful half, the one that's perhaps sustained itself better in the light of events than the environmental thesis, which is the one which, as you just described, made the biggest impact. First thing to say, I mean, it's in the same style, very much the same style, even within the same book as the environmental thesis. It's all kind of mixed up together, which is generally Beck's kind of style, which makes it rather difficult to read, I think, for a lot of people. But the essential thing it's concerned with is not so much the, to use the language, extensivity of the global, but the intensitivity of the individual. And what he's essentially looking at are the distinctive patterns and the intensification of individualizing trends in the post-1950s in Western societies. And he goes so far as to call it a second modernity. And this is obviously central to his whole thesis, that we are living not in the classical traditional modernity of the 50s and prior to that period, but a new period altogether. And that's obviously a very bold claim, which I might come back to at the end, and has provoked enormous controversy, the idea that Beck has the audacity to coin a new phase of modernity. Now his idea of individualisation or individuation, another all these sociological terms banging around here, is usefully distinguished from the kind of classical sense of individualism as autonomy, and also from the sense from Durkheim of the idea of anomie, of individualisation becoming a destructive kind of process. So he's not really talking about us all becoming narcissists or living alone, although a lot of us are, I think, in the Western world today. What he's essentially talking about, and this is the phrase he uses again and again and again, is the compulsion to make a life of one's own. That in the second modernity, we are now in a circumstance where, like it or not, we are compelled to make a life of our own and remake that life almost on a daily kind of basis. And it's a life which is constantly negotiated amidst uncertainty. And amidst another thing which he goes on about is the bewildering array of choice. You know, we are confronted with this society where what was previously something which we had no option of making a choice about, we're now almost at the other end of the spectrum and confronted with a bewildering array of things to choose from and to steer our way around. Now, to break the idea down a little bit, there's a kind of series of stages here. I think you kind of have to kind of work it out for yourself to a large extent because of the chaos of his writing. The first kind of stage of this process is what he refers to as disembedding, and alongside that, de-traditionalization. Basically talking about the idea that traditional social relations, bonds, beliefs, that structured modern society have tended, since the 1950s, to break down. And the affiliations and ties that once provided a stable framework through which to negotiate our lives, our families, our communities, our nation, religion, tend to become eroded. And he's also within this, he writes. He's a tremendously wide-ranging writer. Remember, he does write specifically about certain developments within that. For example, the destruction in the 1970s of the manufacturing sector, particularly in the United States, which essentially destroys the basis for that nuclear family on the right-hand side there, because the average working Joe can no longer afford to be able to do that. And that in itself is a material kind of driving force in this process of disembedding and de-traditionalization. So this disembedding process obviously creates fantastic opportunities. This creates the basis for freedom. This is in one respect a liberatory kind of moment in relation to the family or in relation to the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And I think other writers like Giddens tend to take more of a kind of a positive impulse out of that. But Beck tends to focus more on immediately the fact that these are replaced by a whole set of new pressures and constraints, okay, which are replacing those traditional ones. And this is where he comes to this, another phrase for you, in institutionalized individualism. And what he's talking about here is a whole array of structural and institutional pressures which are replacing the traditional ones and are directing us in a way that we start to kind of live that life of our own, and we are compelled to do so. So, I mean, he's talking about basic things, a competitive, flexible job market where there's no job for life any longer, and it requires constant performance and retraining. Talking about the pressure for young people to be able to perform in a knowledge economy. So education becomes transformed in the process as well. And in general terms, he's talking about how our rights, our obligations are no longer addressed to collectivities like community and family, but are individually orientated. And those are experienced as kind of individual pressures. And this means that our identity is at least potentially transformed from being a given thing, which we don't have to think about, to be conscious about, into a task. something we are charged with responsibility for and are also charged with the responsibility of the consequences. Here's an illustration, and I think he at some point actually uses an illustration. I can't remember if it was a conversation or an article, but consider getting the modern family together around a table to eat. I don't know if there are any parents in the room, but this is a Herculean task in my experience, and something which we can actually, some people have actually documented as being in significant decline since the 1970s. Because the task of getting the family around a table to eat on a regular evening basis is very difficult because, of course, all the pressures on the individuals in that family are pulling them apart, are disaggregating them. Because we're looking at a situation for a start-off where it's likely both the mother and the father work, it's likely they work under flexible working conditions. Then we've got the children who are not only kind of under a great deal of pressure to perform well at school, but are likely to be involved in all sorts of after-school activities, especially in an area like Princeton, I suspect. They'll be learning Mandarin and Tai Chi and everything else. And being able to kind of juggle this whole kind of diary and timetable is obviously quite a difficult task. But I think kind of does capture the process there, whereby, yes, you can still do it. You can get everyone, and I've done it myself. I've got my family around the table on a fairly regular basis. But it's a conscious task, of course. In the past, it was imposed by the working timetable of the father, etc. It was something you didn't have to think about, but now has to be consciously recreated. And quite successfully, as far as the literature on the American family goes, that at least the middle class have managed to kind of recreate a neo-traditional family. But it is very much a conscious and a very exhausting, I think someone mentioned earlier, a very exhausting kind of operation. Particularly so because this process has to take place, in his analysis, under conditions of much higher expectations, continuing with the example of family life. Those institutionalized pressures demand, the full attention and engagement of the individual. And we're talking here about, staying on the family again, we're talking about individual fulfillment now, rather than simply marriage as an expected process, and a situation where we are seeking self-fulfillment with a special person. Or the example of being a father, again, something close to my heart in terms of kind of, yes, on the one hand, you have, for the first time compared to previous generations, the possibility of being an involved father, and that's a fantastic pleasure and a joy. But at the same time, it's a kind of, well, what do you do? How do you be this good father, which we are instructed that we are supposed to aspire towards? Because that's taking place, and this, I suppose, is the kind of final twist to the story, which I think is quite interesting, and he's quite astute at pointing out. We have to perform this task under a situation of very few guiding norms or assumptions. Okay? So we're free to become this involved father, but how do you do that? Well, in terms of looking for any precedent there or any guidance from the past, certainly in my experience of my generation, the only kind of experience I can think back to are almost entirely negative ones. My exposure to my father, like most friends of mine from my generation, was a very limited one, and their role was very straightforward. It was to put food on the table, and it was to be the kind of ultimate arbiter of discipline. Straightforward, and I don't think you had to think a great deal about that in order to do that reasonably well. It wasn't a particularly conscious process. But now, in a situation where you are free to be able to perform that role in a much fuller role, at the same time you're left in a situation of having to individually negotiate that and find a way in order to find out exactly what you're supposed to do. A couple of examples. How do you decide when the child is supposed to be able to walk to school on their own alone? When are they supposed to have a mobile phone? I mean, there's a kind of bewildering range of these types of questions which have to be negotiated on a kind of daily basis. And I have to say, in my kind of experience, a lot of the way the kind of amusing aspect of this is the way that people you observe kind of find themselves making this stuff up as they go along, trying to pick up tips in the playground about kind of trying to find out when other parents allow their children to have a mobile phone or to allow them to walk to school, and you're kind of accumulating this kind of this from the ether, and it's quite a tiring task. A further twist, just a final twist on this, of course, in relation to the child example and the family example, I think you could say that this takes place in an environment of quite often quite focused anxiety. about sexual predators, about child safety, which again I think is something which has become intensified very significantly since the period of the 1950s and the first modernity. Right, moving towards a close, some kind of assessing thoughts about this. Now, the individualisation part of this thesis made very little impact in the English-speaking world. It remained a kind of German debate, which they had amongst themselves from the early 80s. And of course that begs certain questions as to why that was. Well, there's a whole range of answers one can give, but just what I'd like to focus on here is, well, the obvious fact is we're talking about much less demonstrable processes of change. I mean, we're talking about kind of changes beneath the surface essentially here, where people might still be doing the same things, getting married, having children, etc., but the meaning of those acts has become significantly different. So, you know, they're not the easiest things to be able to track over the process of time. It's also the case, a little bit like the other side of the thesis, that lots of his propositions don't actually factually stack up. I mean, in terms of trying to demonstrate these processes on a consistent basis across societies, well, partly no one's really attempted to do so, but certainly there's other people who've been able to find examples where, you know, inequality in class is still far more important than risk, kind of thing, or more important than individualisation and insecurity. I think it's also fair to say that within this discipline of sociology, he's not mostly been taken very kindly to, because in lots of ways he's challenging the central categories with which people do their work. Class, inequality, this is the bread and butter of most of the people he was trying to get his thesis accepted amongst. And on a broader level, I'd also point out, and I think this is kind of interesting to me, is that he was also very much challenging, and I think this is one of his best features actually, he's kind of essentially challenging the way in which there's a kind of overemphasis on the process of continuity in historical development. And he's basically all the time saying, no, don't just look at the continuities, let's look at the discontinuities. Okay, just because it's called marriage and people are still getting married, that doesn't mean to say it's essentially the same thing. And that's all the time a kind of his kind of imploring, but also the reason why amongst sociologists, mainstream sociology, he didn't go down too well for the most part. Last two slides, am I okay? Miguel, yeah. Now, just before my last points about that, just to take a step back, it's important to realise what he was trying to do, okay, and kind of what kind of guy he was. He was variously described, lots of kind of words for this. He's been called a provocateur, justifiably, because he is out to provoke, okay. And that colours his style and nature of writing. He's out to kind of get you reacting to what he's saying, getting you to think about what he's saying, even if that involves exaggeration, overstatement, hyperbole. There's a reason behind the madness, if you like. In German, there's this word which I've never quite understood. Querdenker. Do you know this word? I don't think there's any kind of adequate translation for it, but yeah, it's kind of similar to provocateur, is it? It's kind of thinking sideways, yes. And there's iconoclast, there's all sorts of terms, aren't there, which you could... But anyway, the thing I want to kind of... He's a guy who's out to shake things up, okay? And he's a public sociologist as well. He's certainly not a bookish academic who wants to kind of stay on the same thesis for the rest of his life. So all of his writing has that character to it. Now, we also got to appreciate that he perceived himself as very much in a kind of battle with traditional sociology and the categories through which it thought. I mean, he went so far as to often refer to the categories which sociology used as zombie categories, i.e. they were empty. Class, inequality, all those things have become so overused and so kind of misappropriated that they've become kind of fairly useless. And also bear in mind that, you know, he was quite explicit that the ideas he was putting forward were what he called a projected social theory. It could be like this, he's kind of saying. These are trends which sometimes get taken a bit too literally when we read it, and it's understandable why we would do. But he is kind of projecting a certain vision of how things might be if we don't do something about it. So I think from that you get a bit of a sense of why the style of writing and in terms of presentation and content is kind of quite deliberately one-sided and also quite wide-ranging, how he kind of jumps from one minute talking about the family to the next minute talking about international institutions, which is kind of maddening to read. But he's trying to convince you. He's throwing all this stuff at you to say, look, the world has bloody changed. It's not the same as it was before. Please try and realise. Here's another example. Here's another example. Here's another example. Which I think we have to kind of still say that's not a very good way of doing things, but understand what he's actually trying to do. And last point. So. To be a bit more specific, I mean, he's particularly frustrated that sociology is overly focused on continuities and not enough on kind of the breaks, the points at which marriage becomes something different, even if it's called the same thing. If people are getting married not because they are obliged by their community to do, but are getting married for individual fulfilment, then that's a quite different kind of deal there. And essentially there he's having a go at, in his terms, the formalism of functionalist ways of thinking, that marriage must always be playing the same role in a society because a society is like a functioning organism. That's his beef. That's what he's having a go at there. And I think for me what's good about this is I think those are always good questions to ask. Just because something's called the same thing doesn't mean it essentially plays the same function or has the same meaning for people. And essentially what you're talking about there is being able to be historically specific about what you're looking at, okay? Looking at it in its specific historical context, rather than simply kind of lazily perhaps assuming that it continues to play the same kind of role throughout history. So it's a kind of provocation, the whole thing, in a sense, and you have to read it in that spirit. But I personally think, whilst I wouldn't kind of be held to defending every aspect of it by any means, I certainly, for my thinking and thinking about the kinds of studies I organise and get involved in, it's often provided a useful framework, especially in terms of the way he's kind of thinking about and emphasising the whole process of historical change. Thank you.
I was particularly sensitive to and interested in the critique that surfaced, the critique of Beck that surfaced in particular in the three first talks revolving around the issue of reflexive modernity, and that I think Rosemary was most explicit in formulating. That came up also in my own talk, and we showed the facility as well in Angela's talk. The issue, said Rosemary, is the fact that it's about Beck forgetting agents, you said, and collective action. It seems to me between the reflexive modern world that Beck talks about in this abstract and in a way very unhistorical way, and the agents, there's a whole set of institutions that can be thought of as being reflexive insofar as they allow protest and critique to be formulated and voiced. So there's a level of thinking about reflexive modernization as a set of reflexive institutions, reflexive organizations, a bit in the way that maybe what's his name, Boltanski talks about critical institutions, institutional criticism, he talks. And so that would be the first aspect of a flow, perhaps, in Beck's concept of reflexivity. But I mean, actually, it's a question that I have for everyone here. Are we talking about a flow in this sense of Beck's concept of reflexive modernization in the sense that it lacks an institutional concept that would also make the theory more historical and less of a sort of disembodied and abstract Hegelianism about the end of time where everything is fine in the end. And another problem with, it seems to me that might be with his theory of reflexivity is the fact that in the end, doesn't he tend to define reflexivity as a sort of post facto capacity to resolve problems by getting together and thinking about the problems that have arisen out of previous action, rather than through a more cautious attitude toward the possibility of unintended consequences arising in particular out of actors thinking through things and making up plans, down the line of history. So, in that sense, reflexive modernity would be more of a sort of demanding imperatives than a diagnosis of everything is wonderful, in this world, because we have reached a sort of systemic reflexivity that, yeah. And finally, another.
I'm sorry, Alexander. I have to. Okay.
I just wanted to hint at the individualistic aspect of reflexivity, and that takes me to the last talk. In the end, Beck conceives of reflexivity as this individualistic thing again, and not as a systemic or institutional reality, and that's also might be a problem. I don't know.
You want to go?
I think it's a very interesting point in terms of the, well, I guess I will also ask the question of you. If he were to say what you said, then that would be great, but I'm not sure that he does about institutions. In other words, no, he doesn't, but it's a lovely way of you putting it. I mean, when I think of him, I always think, like, what is carrying this, what is carrying the capacity to think, reflect on what is happening and constantly remake it? I think it's more, sometimes the ideas are indeed somewhat disembodied, but it's often social movements. I mean, I think he is a product of his time, and his time he was writing in the 80s. And so you had civil rights, feminism, this, that, and that. But if he were to build it in and then look at these intermediate institutions as a way of making that happen. I was just trying to think could I think of any examples? But yeah, anyway, it's somewhat incoherently I'm trying to say that it would be good if he did what you said he did, and it would certainly be a place to push research forward, because then you could make him much more interesting. If it's not just new social movements, but that somehow the reflexive modernization capacity is built into institutions.
I mean, I actually think it's disembodied Hegelianism, although that implies an embodied Hegelianism, and I don't know what that would look like.
It's called Marxism.
Yes.
But the one thing I would disagree with in your characterization is I don't see reflexive modernization as happy. It's more that we have this wonderful, we have a very dirty pot, and we started cleaning it with this caustic stuff. And unfortunately, when the pot is clean, the way modernity would like it to be, the caustic stuff starts eating the pot. So it seems to me that reflexive modernization is sort of, you can't turn off modernization once it starts, and then it starts eating itself. So I didn't see that as a positive thing. I saw that as a, to throw another metaphor, Sorcerer's Apprentice kind of thing. You've started it, and now it's, Mickey Mouse can't make the mopping stop.
So you don't think he's utopian?
That's
the dismal side of it.
It could be that this, my engagement with this is so thoroughly colored with graduate school that maybe there's a dismalness that. But I think that's. Graduate students here are like, yes, our reading is dismal. But I don't see the utopianism quite so much. I see, I would say, an anxiety about what it would do. It could end up nicely, but I don't see him. I don't see him expecting it will.
I would just add that for me, the conundrum at the heart of Risk Society is the dependence on scientific expertise. Individuals don't have an easy way to counteract these systemic problems. He talks about how industry co-ops scientific expertise and the effect and the attempts to distract from their responsibility. And he also talks more at risk, I think, about the reliance of environmental movements as well on scientific expertise. He doesn't have a very robust notion of vernacular knowledge as a counterweight to scientific expertise. And that seems to me to be a problem. And also scientific expertise has its own tremendous limitations. In fact, I think sometimes he doesn't take those limitations seriously enough. So yeah, I don't see any easy solutions to that. If that is correct, that aspect, that feature of his theory seems rather dismal in its outlook.
I'm not sure I understand this in any degree of completeness, but what comes to mind, well, one thing I was curious about, you were talking about, okay, 3 Mile Island, yes, Chernobyl, no. And I'm not quite sure what distinguishes one from the other, aside from whether somebody had a hand on a lever or it could have been prevented or whatever. But what does occur to me is the idea that in the Chernobyl example, maybe in a sense this was imposed from the outside. Is that a characteristic of this? For example, I'm thinking of Bhopal in India. A foreign corporation comes in, it's a devil's bargain. You get jobs in your community, but you have to give up, you have to take on a great deal of risk, which, chickens came home to roost here in Bhopal. And I'm wondering if that, combined with some sort of a race to the bottom, that a corporation can shop around and find somebody willing to take on the risk of doing the kinds of things that will make money for the corporation. Is that in any way involved in this idea of risk?
I think that absolutely captures what Beck is talking about in all of those cases. The weird case for me is this guy Perot with the normal accidents, who has a very specific definition of what it is. And the reason why the thing that distinguishes 3 Mile Island is that the malfunction is in the safety system. So the safety system and the monitoring system itself is what goes wrong, which creates the meltdown. Whereas in Chernobyl, they're testing the backup system, but it's human beings doing it. What he wants is a system where no individual human being can possibly cause the accident knowingly, or see it while it's happening. That is so restrictive that it probably doesn't even meet 3 Mile Island. It probably accounts for almost no cases, but Bhopal is perfectly Beckian in its structure because it's about the fusion of capitalism with distributions of bads. That's a lovely quotation. So I think that, in a sense, if you are looking for someone to help you sort out the connection between global capitalism and global risk distribution, I would not turn to Perot, I would turn to this.
I asked this as a senior who's about to graduate. And,
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Well, not quite there yet. So could go either way. And I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the idea of the trap of scientific expertise in risk society. You just mentioned that, and you mentioned that there was no really easy answer to this. So I hope you don't mind me sort of pressing back a little bit. Am I right in characterizing your critique of Beck as sort of perhaps that he's not fully cognizant of a set of scientism, of a set of ideologies cloaking sort of empirical inquiry that espouses a certain sort of rationality? I'm thinking of Hardin and his critique that that certain scientific journals assume that every problem in question has a scientific solution, and when in actuality, Hardin argues that not everything is a solution. So, do you see a way out of this scientism? Are there any things that we can do to get out of it? Forgive me if that was not terribly close.
No. Well, first of all, I do think scientism is part of the issue in Beck's critique. I think that dilemma is a little bit more fundamental, and it has to do with how he regards knowledge. Because on the one hand, his ability to diagnose these ecological catastrophes relies on scientific knowledge. And at the same time, scientific rationality refutes itself and is unable to contain these disasters. So science is both right and wrong, if you see what I'm saying. So I think that's the conundrum. And the other thing is that it seems to me that for Beck, the only individuals who can have this knowledge, problematic as the knowledge is, are people who are trained in the sciences, who are professionals, who are experts. And other theorists, other sociologists have tried to argue that there's epistemic value in the knowledge that comes from non-experts, and particularly from lay individuals who have the first-hand knowledge as patients or workers or parents or whatever with the situation. So I think in that sense, other scholars have tried to theorize ways in which individuals who are not scientists can have knowledge about the natural world, which can give them authority to challenge the way the state is operating or the way safety standards are set or the cause of something being attributed in the way it is. It's not clear to me that Beck really has space for non-scientists to be authoritative in this way. And it's problematic in its own way to argue for lay expertise, because you could see the anti-vaccination movement as lay expertise, and it's not a lay expertise that many people would be happy with, okay? So, I mean, this has its own issues, but that's what I'm trying to say, that science is both right and wrong in Beck in ways that I think at one level seem deeply right. I mean, that sense of science's reliability and simultaneous fallibility seems at one level to be actually insightful, but I think it creates problems for the status of knowledge in his theory. That's what I was trying to say. And I would just also really underscore the chronological point that Michael was making, and I misspoke a little bit at the beginning. I said Beck published in German. He wrote in German, before the Chernobyl accident, but it is really true that his theory is seen through Chernobyl. And see, this, again, and this is what I was trying to point to, is a problem, because I think that Beck's gloominess is predicated on thinking that the scientists truly understand the risks of radiation and the consequences of radiation, for instance. But I actually think that there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty among scientists around those issues and between experts of different stripes. And that taking seriously scientific uncertainty at one level can make one even more pessimistic about the ability to address the situation, but I think can also help to explain some of the problems and some of the reasons that states and different actors don't intervene helpfully.
Just want to build on the individualization. I'm wondering if that didn't get picked up because it's, no disrespect to Beck, but it's German ideology with a little bit of Freud and Frankfurt theory and sort of the disenchantment of the world, a little bit of Weber. I mean, it's so that stuff. But what he didn't do, I don't think, and I'm not an expert on Beck, is link the two things. And it seems what makes the Risk Society so interesting is this combination with individualization, because everything becomes about risk to me. So if it was just risk to the aggregate system, that'd be one thing. But there's this risk out there, and I'm susceptible to it. And that's the only thing that really matters. So the school system is not about producing educated children. The school system is about my kid getting into Harvard. And it's almost like high emphasis on risk with individualization is almost defining neoliberalism. I mean, and does he ever sort of combine these two, that what makes this risk society so particularly difficult is that nobody's willing to take one for the Gipper, as it were, or work as a community, because it's all about the risk to me. And as long as I'm protected, as long as I've securitized, as long as I've got my hedges, I don't give a damn.
Well, I don't think, I mean, I think if you look at his writing on Europe, what was it, German Europe, and then all this stuff in the European Union. I mean, I don't find, I don't think it was all risk to me. I mean, he was thinking a lot about how these transnational capacities. And so in the end, I'm surprised that I don't find him nearly as pessimistic as you both, because especially when he's A, talking about the potential of Europe, and B, and he was criticizing Germany in some ways, which he could do, being German. But so on the one hand, he looks at Europe and says, yeah, they've really managed, to get away from this sort of nationalistic model, etc. But then when he talks about the new social movements, I felt that and then you combine that with the reflexive modernization, I felt that no, he was saying there really are these new ideas and these new carriers of new ideas. I mean, he doesn't use the notion of lay knowledge, but he doesn't see it, I don't think he does see it as coming entirely from the scientists. I mean, it is, as you say, a problem for him. But I see him as scientism was industrial society. And it was proven to have these big problems. And now we've got risk society. And in a way, we can be more optimistic about the science and where it's coming from.
I don't know.
I mean,
for him, risk society comes into being in the 50s and 60s, which is basically to say in the nuclear age and the age of petrochemicals.
Right.
So I actually think so many examples are don't lead us to be optimistic. And environmental contamination is like really crucial in representing what the inevitable outcome of this kind of reliance on science and technology is. So whether it's as bad as he says, I don't know. I mean, by world at risk, he's talking a lot more about climate change and a lot less about contamination. So it's a bit of a moving target what the real environmental catastrophe is. To get to your question, for me, I mean, part of it is the way the book is organized, because this whole section on science, technology, and risk, another whole section on individualization, and a section on reflexive modernization. I read Beck as saying that the hinge that connects the world of these environmental contaminants and society, late capitalism, science, technology, and risk, and individualization, the family, changed gender goals, is reflexive modernization. That's the kind of growing awareness of individuals and of the society of these dilemmas in the light of all these other changes that come out of economic and technological development. That's really what holds it together. Having said that, it's precisely on the point of reflexive modernization that I find him to be so elusive, or most elusive. So for me, that's part of why his emphasis on individualization and his part on risk and the environment, I find them very, very insightful, both, but I don't feel that they're as well integrated as they might be, because I actually think reflexivity is the way to integrate them, and he has a very slippery notion of what that actually is, and whether it's a property of the society or the individual.
Well, it's quite a strange thing that the two things aren't joined together. I said it's the other half of the theory, that's how we put it. You've got two halves of the theory. They don't actually meet at a certain point. And for me, it's kind of, because he was such a scattergun, he's writing about so many different issues, quite usefully, and kind of throwing things out there sideways. He doesn't actually push things through. This is one of the shortcomings, I think, of being like a public sociologist who's dealing with so many different things. He doesn't push it through logically to say what you say, which is also my point in terms of what I look at my research. Because, be more specific, if you're living in a world of uncertainty, as a parent or whatever you're always looking for risks to kind of embody that uncertainty. We're looking for kind of Monsanto foods, or we're looking for something to kind of have a focus that allows us to organise ourselves and create new routines and rituals, even if it's kind of a fairly fantastical one. Sort of too much sugar in little Johnny's drinks and blah blah blah. I mean, there's a whole things we make up as parents. So the whole idea of going from uncertainty to risk, which doesn't actually push it through, it's a shame, I think, actually. I'd also just want one thing on the nuclear stuff. I mean, it has to be said. I mean, I find this slightly grievous because I spent a long time working out and trying to understand the science of radiation for a book I did, and I'm the least natural, scientifically oriented person in the world. Beck didn't know the first thing about it. I mean, it has to be said, and it's working. He did not read a word about it. He's working purely on the idea of, hey, something invisible, hey, you can cross boundaries. I mean, it's not a great deal more than that.
Well, at the time he's trying to get his access is nuclear-free stuff from the early '80s. That's what he's got.
Yeah.
Social movements that he's part of.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm going to open a can of worms here that I'm all going to get yelled at, and probably it's wrong. But maybe part of the reason why the environmental stuff gets picked up so much and the individual stuff doesn't is the risk society, the environmental stuff maps onto Anthropocene very neatly. It's petrochemicals and it's nuclear stuff, and that's what the Anthropocene is, and that's all about individual people pursuing maximization and killing everybody else and not caring. And that risk society stuff maps onto Anthropocene talk really nicely, and the individualization stuff doesn't.
It's true.
And maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's that different memes start reinforcing each other over here, and we lose one half.
Just one thing to mention, which is quite ironic about him, even though the last project he was doing before he died was actually he got a big grant for climate change research. But he was really late to climate change.
He was
really late to the issue of climate change.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, and Giddens, who he worked with a lot, wasn't, but Beck was completely oblivious to it for a long time.
Can I make one more small comment, which is that I think it's very useful to put Beck side by side, Douglas and how do you say his name?
Witkowski.
Yeah, Witkowski's on risk and culture, because their understandings of risk and history are so very different. So risk and culture basically is about how we've always thought there were risks. And so now our focus on environmental risks is just the latest way of reinventing what used to be supernatural entities or whatever. So, you know, they see nothing distinctive about the current world of science and technology, except that people are so poor at comparing the risks from, you know, capitalist products and from contaminants as compared with risk in their everyday lives. So I think in that sense, part of what makes Beck so distinctive is his insistence that the science and technology of this era and the movement of industrialization away from mechanization to the proliferation of chemical substances really produces a whole new kind of risk that hasn't existed before. And it's uncontainable and it's imperceptible.
Good. Peter, the last question?
We're running out of time, but this is the kind of question nobody needs to answer. The panel's enormously illuminating, and you all know much more about Beck than I do, but as you were all talking, I couldn't help but think that this book could have been as you outlined it, could very plausibly have been written in Britain in 1786 rather than 1986. The appearance of all sorts of new risks, air pollution is certainly not new. This is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The shift in how people had to see themselves, suddenly people had to make their own way in a new economy, et cetera, et cetera. Is there any possibility that he's taking a set of developments that are in fact quite old and presenting them perhaps overly extravagantly as new?
Well, Harry Douglas would have said so, obviously, but I don't know.
This might tie to Angela's point about the science. If you were saying England in the 1830s with cholera, it might look like the same thing, but we actually now know what causes cholera, and so the risk of it is actually not distributed in this invisible, untrackable, uncontrollable kind of way. So maybe the risk society notion that he's picking on is local to the state of knowledge at each moment in time, and that you could have written it in the 1780s, but then it would have become obsolete because we would understand where hurricanes came from, or whatever the risk that's associated with. We'd understand, although we don't, why the South Sea bubble crashed the way it did, etc. That's an incoherent response to an extremely sharp question, but I think there's something, I think you're onto something about how locally specific the unexplainable and impenetrable, invisible is, and as our knowledge, the horizon of our knowledge moves, that gets deferred to some new set of risks.
And so someone said sociology should be retitled The Anxiety of Modernity. We keep saying the same story over and over and over again. Thank you, that was great.
Thank you.